Hey folks, it's Dr. H, your friendly war game guy at the Air Command and Staff College. This is the first of a series of videos introducing the maritime rules. The maritime rules aren't really that complicated, but you can watch the videos and take a look at the rules and have a sense of how to do this after watching the videos. And then if you want to practice a little bit, probably a good idea, push the pieces yourself for a little bit. You'll get the hang of it relatively quickly. This is easier than the land or the air rules by a noticeable amount. This first video, I want to orient you a bit to the map, and also the pieces that are used in the game to give you a sense of what those are like. So, this is the map of the Pacific. There is a map in Russia and Poland of the Baltic. There is a map in Iran of the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Seas. We'll talk about those a little bit later when we get closer to CW. That way you can, look up the one for your game. But they're generally fairly similar. You have these sort of big zones. These zones regulate naval movement and air ranges. We'll talk about those a little bit, exactly how those work a little bit later. But we'll come to them. But just be aware that those work that way. You have some of these zones you can see have these sort of big hexes. Those big hexes are for fighting in what are essentially small islands, right? So if you want to put a bunch, we're not going to track that hex by hex, but if there are red forces in the parcels and there are blue forces in the parcels, you put the blue forces down here, you put the red forces up there, and they fight. They sort of fight in their own turns for control of the parcels, or the parasols. I should probably learn how to pronounce things, huh? You'll also see that there are accompanying boxes marked inshore, right? In several of these places, including up here in Tonkin, and in other places like the Yellow Sea, which affects Korea. Being inshore means you're close enough to conduct amphibious operations or provide support to forces in these either big hexes or to enter onto the operational maps of Vietnam. You can see we have the Vietnam operational map here, and we have next word Korea operational maps. They're here. So if you're in the inshore boxes, you are moving in to do things in those areas, right? So keep that in mind. That's what it means, right? If you're in the sea zone, you're out. If you're out here in the zone, right, you're steaming around the Ryukyu Islands, Ryukyu Islands here. Doing naval stuff here. If you're in the Senkaku's inshore box, you are conducting operations in support of forces in the Senkaku's. Keep that in mind, right? Let's see. Another thing to point out are these air superiority markers, right? If the plane can fly into this zone, it can participate in air superiority depending on where it is. So if you have this sort of ochre color, Vietnam, this blue color, Taiwan, this red color, Korea. Also, this tells you, right, if you have air superiority in Korea or Taiwan or Vietnam, you also have air superiority in those zones, which may matter. You'll note, for example, no one can really get air superiority over the central approaches right? There's no people aren't going to get air superiority that far. There's just too much ocean and kind of far away from land to really be able to do that. And if there are conflicts about who has air superiority in these things, we'll talk about the rules for that later. You can also see marked in each one of these zones, right? There's this radar-looking screen with numbers next to it. These are modifiers for naval detection. We'll talk about that in due time. But be aware, right, that those are per zone. So here the Marianas, China gets +2, the United States gets -2 to detecting enemy naval forces in those zones. So again, we'll talk about that in due time. Just be aware that that's going to be there. Some of these, we have ports, right? So these oval markers can represent ports. They can be in the port. You can be in port in the Philippines or Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaya, Japan. So just be aware that those are things that exist. There are also these arrows, as you can see, that represents air mobile movement. We're not going to we'll talk about that later when it really comes down to it. Just be aware that you can fly helicopters to some of these places. You also have some places that you conduct airborne assaults. It's fine. We'll talk about that again later. If you see these red squares, China can use cruise missiles for certain effects there. We'll talk about what those effects are in their own time. Just be aware that that's what that means. You can see that these are sort of gray, these sort of ghosted cruise missile markers. If certain diplomatic conditions existed, then China can use those. Those conditions are not likely to exist in our playthroughs of Next War. We'll just leave it at that for now. So, yep, down here you have some charts and some reminders. You know, your naval detection charts here. Your air unit ranges are here. Your naval unit ADF values are here. These are just there. We'll talk about exactly what those are coming up. Just be aware, like, some chart information and some game information is printed on the naval chart. You can see up here a track that's labeled submarine threat and ASW levels. This represents a general level of blue and red's commitment to the undersea game. It has effects. We'll talk about what those effects are when the time comes. Just be aware that this track is where you keep track of that, and when it asks, this is where you look to find it. Let's see. And actually, I need to come over to here. So if you come over here, you'll see these are tracks for aircraft carriers and also amphibs to keep track of air units. So if an air unit's on a particular carrier, you put those air units on this track to do the same thing that they do up here, right? So you have a ready, you have a flown, you have aborted boxes. They serve the same purpose as they do up here for these airbase holding boxes that we've been using in the air game, but these track for individual carriers and individual air wings. You can see the Chinese have theirs up here as well. So that covers the map. Let's talk about the pieces. Now, your reference for the pieces and where to learn more about them is actually on the inside cover of the front cover of the rules. You can see we have sample units and combat identification. This one that explains the naval markers. I'll go over it sort of quickly. Naval markers look like this, but in their country's color. Let me zoom in a little bit, make this a little bit clearer. Okay. So, right, for example, we have SAGs, surface action groups, carrier strike groups, and we have amphibs. These numbers help you keep track of which air units belong to which one. Reading it is fairly simple, right? You have a name and sometimes a number, again, that helps you identify the tracks that you're using to keep track of the airplanes. You have, on amphibious units, you have a number here above the ship. That is the number of stacking points that you can carry on that ship, on the ship marker of Marines, and to conduct amphibious assaults. This number 1 here is the number of internal heliborne movements it has. So this can move per movement step 1 stacking point of troops by helicopter just inherently that won't use your air mobile points to fly them off of or onto the amphibs. And then again, this 4 is what it carries. This big 2 is its support number. This is also used for conducting naval strikes. And this superscript number here is its range in hexes if it's on the operational map, right? So just keep in mind this big number is used for conducting support and strikes. You can see the SAG can't carry any troops and has no heliborne points. Same with the carrier. So really only the amphibs carry troops and also have heliborne points. The carriers don't, and you can see these numbers here: strike and strike. So that's how you read these. Again, super simple. I want to show you a couple of charts. We're not going to go over what they are. I just want to point out that they exist so that you're aware. Charts. These are going to be in your standard charts. On your sort of standard and advanced game tables, this one marked here, I want to point out the existence of this chart, the sea control chart. You're going to need that once per turn. Contested sea movement, you're going to need this a fair bit in adjudicating the turn. You'll also be referencing as we go along the advanced charts. There we go. You'll also be referencing as we go along the strike charts that you have been using. You'll be using the air defense charts and then the strike charts that you've been using already right? All of this air defense stuff and all the strikes are resolved ultimately using the same charts you've already been using for airstrikes and other strikes in the game. So no new charts there. The only new charts to really think about, as I've pointed out, are the standby, right? This sea control and contested sea movement. We'll talk about that in due time. Another chart that I'd like to point out to you that's important is on the back of the rules. It's on the back of the rules, and this flow chart here is going to help you understand naval movement and sea movement. There's a big reference here, and also this flow chart helps you understand if you are conducting contested movement or just regular movement. We'll talk about that when we talk about naval movement, so don't get too far ahead of it. Just be aware that this chart exists and have it handy. So that covers charts, components, maps. Let me just look quickly. Maps, other information. That's just the basic stuff for the components and all of that. We'll talk more about the rules for determining sea control and sea movement. We'll talk about air at sea, strikes, and a couple of other things soon. Oh, no. Back up. I also need to talk very quickly about two pieces that aren't in the Vassal module. The EABO, this is for United States Marines. You're conducting expeditionary advanced basing operations. There are rules for that. We'll talk about that later. And then another one that is worth talking about that you will see in the air naval game in AO is this DF 2128 marker. This represents Chinese ballistic anti-ship ballistic missiles. We'll talk about the rules for that in due time, but I just want you to be aware that they exist. And so when you see them, you know what they look like. Okay, I think that about covers it. We'll start going through the sequence of play and talking about how different things work in future videos. For now, this has been naval components and maritime components and an introduction to those. Hopefully that has helped. And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Talk to you soon.